So I'm Sascha Ellers, and I'm a Director of Clinical Operations. I'm from San Francisco, California.
All right, and what does a Director of Clinical Operations do exactly?
So I work with physicians and researchers to run clinical trials. I take the ideas that the clinical staff, the physicians have with a protocol, and I work to implement that protocol. So I will go out to key opinion leaders, which are most likely physicians, try to recruit them to participate in the study. I will work with data that comes out of the study, so data that's from the patients that enroll in the study, do monitoring, which is basically verifying that the data that's recorded for our study is accurate and matches what the data looks like in the patient's medical records.
I see.
And then, all of the work that it takes to oversee the study. It's a regulated environment. So it's regulated by the FDA, or if in some cases research isn't regulated by the FDA, but it's always regulated by good clinical practice and international guidelines on how to take care of patients.
So you have to actually be informed of a lot of different things to be able to carry this out.
Yes.
Now, for those people who may be slightly unfamiliar with how a clinical trial works, or even what one is, can you tell us just briefly the significance of a clinical trial?
Sure. So anytime you want to test an intervention, be it a drug, a diagnostic test, or even just changes in behavior, you want to show that there's actually a difference, you want to run a clinical trial, because that's going to give you the gold standard to show you that there's a difference with your drug or your intervention. So the clinical trial itself is a way to ask your question prospectively, design your experiment in humans, and then implement that study.
I see. So this is sort of like the, prove that it works kind of thing?
Exactly.
And this process, you said itself, is regulated by the government?
By the FDA, correct.
By the FDA. And must you pass a clinical trial to carry out your test or your diagnostic or whatever you want to do? Is that part of the requirement of ever selling your product?
It depends. So to back up, there are three phases of clinical trial development for a drug. There's phase one, where you're looking for your safety. So you got to prove that you're not going to do undue harm to people with your drug. And then in phase two, you're further refining your safety data and you're starting to look at efficacy. Mm-hmm. And then phase three are your large efficacy trials, where you're treating a lot of patients with the drug at that point. So that's kind of the basic methodology. But then within that context, it is regulated by the FDA. They do have a say in what they're going to accept from the phase 3 trials as something that they are willing to approve. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of effort goes into putting together a study that's going to meet their requirements.
It sounds like it takes a lot of time to do this.
Yes.
So it's sort of a big commitment from anybody interested.
Big commitment for companies. A lot of resources go into these trials. In academic settings, a lot of resources will go into these studies as well. A recent example that's been approved is a drug called Zelboraf that looks at a mutation in the melanoma cancer called V600E. So it looks at this mutation and says if the patient is positive for this mutation, if the cancer is positive for this mutation, this would be a good drug for the patient to try. And if they don't have the mutation, they're probably not going to respond to the drug at all. So this is a great example of using genetics in a clinical study to select patients. But you can also use the genetic information to stratify patients if you want to compare patients with the marker to those without. So it would just be a marker that would be used to look at how you could break apart those two groups to look at who did better or not in that case.
Right, and you said, so that's an example of something that sort of went through this process and has been approved?
Yes. Part of the problem with clinical studies is that you're confined to the population that you're testing them in. So sometimes we'll see a signal when we look at the entire data set. There'll be a signal in a subset of patients, but you don't really know why, and you've wasted a lot of money on a negative trial. One of the opportunities that genetics provides is to help us get the right patient on the right trial so that it increases the likelihood that we're going to have a positive outcome for the trial and decreases the risk to the patients or subjects of being exposed to treatments that aren't going to help them. So I think that that's one of the most exciting things about the future of personalized genetics in looking at developing drugs and treatments.
Tell us a bit more about your background. How did you get to be a director of clinical operations? What did you study in school? What did you do before you got here?
Yeah, So I have a bachelor's degree in biology. When I finished school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I feel really lucky that I found this world of clinical studies. So I started out in a CRO, it's a contract research organization. So these are companies that serve pharma companies by helping to run the clinical trials. It's outsourced to that group. And so I had my first job in a company like that, and from there came into biotech and pharma and diagnostics, and have found it to just be a lot of fun. I like to solve problems, right? So it's a great place to apply that.
So it sounds like you really get to, in your job, you really get to sort of be exposed to a lot of ideas and subjects that deal with genetics, but you also really get to sort of, I guess I like the verb wallow in the ethics too, and really have to be concerned about procedure. You have to pay attention to detail. You've got to sort of know technically what's going on, but you've also got to be able to remember where you are and what you're doing with regards to, okay, this is a human study and these are all the things we have to go through.
Yeah, exactly.
In general, how would you describe, how difficult is this job, do you think, compared to other jobs? Or
it's difficult probably in a different way than somebody who's actually crunching the data. We have to think through problems. Like sometimes we'll have a study that it's well designed, it could yield great data, but we just can't find the right subjects that want to join the study. So then a lot of effort goes into recruitment planning for the study. I've never worked on two studies that have the same problems. They're always different. So, and then, it builds on itself. You learn, okay, we got to have recruitment plans in place before we start the study. We've got to think through how we're going to ensure quality data before we start the study. And all of these things that kind of become part of the methodology. But yeah, every study has its own issues, and the landscape changes. Early in my career, I worked on a drug called Sutent. I worked on a phase 1 study of Sutent in gastrointestinal stromal tumors. And so when I saw that it was approved, that was really exciting. I also worked on a drug called pertuzumab. It's called Perjeta, and it's approved for metastatic breast cancer. So that's been exciting.
If somebody's watching you right now and they're super excited, they're like, wow, that sounds like a really cool kind of job, what advice would you give them to either learn more, or what advice would you give them to learn more, or to possibly become a clinical operations director themselves?
So I guess that the main advice would be not to just focus on drug companies, to look across the board for other places that are running studies and see if there are opportunities there.
Would you recommend anybody who's interested to try to get work experience before school experience in this?
I think work experience is the foot in the door that will help to land the job. Yeah.
And what kind of work experience exactly?
So they're entry-level positions running clinical trials. It's called a clinical trial associate.
Okay.
But also background in a physician's practice where they're running studies is another great way to get exposure to it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and wish you the best of luck continuing your clinical operations.
Thank you.